Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out more about the Tuesday morning group coalition meetings online at virginiainstitute.org. Joining us now from the Heritage Foundation, Rachel Greszler, to talk a little bit about the unemployment programs and why it's short-sighted, beyond just instinctual, to continue the extended unemployment benefits for the American economy. Rachel, welcome to the program. How are you doing this weekend?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Well, not at all. And so we all grasp, and I think the inflationary numbers that we're already seeing, the laughable consumer price index that doesn't include gasoline or groceries, even then it's up 5%. The $600 checks are only buying $400 worth of food or other things now. Yet the numbers of people who are staying off the workforce are stunning. I think we all grasp that. Why are the public policy makers swinging and missing at all this?
Well, about half are swinging and missing and half are doing the right thing here, as we have seen half of the governors end these federal pandemic unemployment insurance, basically bonus benefits, early. But they've been incredibly problematic on so many levels. Not only is it contributing to this widespread job shortage, where there are record high 9.2 million job openings in the U.S., and companies are saying they're having to compete with the federal government to get the workers that they need. And of course, that's leading to the inflation. But also it's creating this culture of entitlement that any one individual should be able to say, I don't have to work and I'm entitled to collect half of the paychecks of two other workers for me to sit at home here. And these are the types of programs that have been implemented during the pandemic that some lawmakers are looking to make permanent. They want to mandate some of these components on the states, that they build them into their unemployment insurance programs going forward. But we've seen how problematic that has been during the pandemic, and that's exactly the opposite of what should be done.
Well, by its nature, this is a tax on these businesses, because by making it mandatory in your unemployment insurance, this is another one of the bills that a business has to pay every month in order to operate. So this is a backdoor tax, really, by just saying all these states have to have expanded unemployment insurance that's going to come out of a business's pocket.
Absolutely, and this is actually a good example to individuals that, corporations don't pay taxes, people do. The money, they're not just sitting on piles of cash that they can use up. When you implement a tax, whether that is taxing the earnings of a corporation or if you mandate them to essentially pay higher wages because they can't get workers to come in because the government is paying them more, that translates into higher costs for consumers. We've seen higher prices at the gas station, at the grocery store. There are shortages, and people are waiting weeks, if not months, to get the goods and services that they need. And so it's just a perfect example of how this all translates into higher costs. And on top of that, we see policies like the multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure packages that would exacerbate this, because not only would they add trillions of dollars in taxes on the companies, but then they would implement higher costs that are going to be passed on to individuals, and it's going to be more competition. They say this is a jobs package, but there's already 9.2 million job openings out there. We don't need more job openings available to further raise the compensation that employers have to pay, because that just translates into higher prices for the goods and services they produce.
Rachel, and I'm believe me, doing a radio show every day, you try to get all the information, but I feel like sometimes I'm doing those Evelyn Wood speed reads through public policy because I'm getting the gist, but not necessarily all the facts. But this is so reminiscent of when Hugo Chavez first mandated wages at a higher level in Venezuela, and then followed it, a year or so later with with price controls, and all the businesses started to close in a country that is arguably almost as resource rich as the United States is.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately the pathway that we're getting through to when you put together all of the things that have been proposed, from the multi-trillion-dollar packages that would have the government in control of the types of jobs that are out there. They're talking about subsidizing child care and providing all these benefits to families. But then when you get into it, they're also talking about kind of controlling the wages of workers. They're talking about implementing subsidies to child care workers, to healthcare workers, and that sounds like a great thing. We all want those workers to be receiving higher wages, but is it really the government's role to decide what sectors of the economy are most worthy of what certain wages? And that's exactly the path that you start going down, is just government control of wages, government control of people's lives. And the spending alone is taking away from people's personal freedoms, because what we're talking about here under this Biden agenda and proposal is that the average household has to work until May just to pay their tab to the government.
Gee.
And then they only have, from May until December to be able to keep their earnings to produce, to have what they need to support their own families and do the things that they want to.
You mentioned the social infrastructure that they're proposing in the second wave, that the Republicans seem to have been fooled into thinking, the Rob Portmans and so on and so forth, they've been fooled into thinking that these are not the entitlements you were looking for, and they're going to come with a round two of these social infrastructure plans. How, even if we stop this legislatively, how do we win the argument on Main Street when people are hearing AOC saying working for Amazon is akin to being a slave, when we hear people saying, but we are each other's infrastructure and you should be guaranteed the services of a daycare provider or a radio show host or a server at a restaurant? Where does it end if we start convincing the population that this is good policy?
Yeah, it's easy to convince people that a handout from the government will be good for them, whether it's a handout for a child care subsidy or whether it's a handout in the form of a $15 minimum wage that forces employers to pay workers more without them actually producing anything more of value, or if it's a, quote, free college education. But you have to look at both sides of the ledger, and that's the big fault of liberal politicians these days, that they're only looking at what they, quote, as government can provide, but where is that coming from? They're essentially creating entitlements of certain people in the economy to have a right to the earnings of other workers, and at some point that just falls apart, because who wants to work when half or more of their paycheck is going to go to somebody else? And it also gets into the personal choices. Yes, lots of families need child care, but do they want only one option of a government-directed program, similar to what happened in Quebec, where it looks on the surface like it was wildly successful? It increased the labor force participation of women. It shifted tons of children from family-based care into institutionalized, government-directed child care. And so it increased incomes, it increased wages, it increased government revenues. But it was terrible for families and for children. There were so many negative consequences, and that's where it's short-sighted here, is that the role of government is to protect people's freedoms and to create an environment where they can make the choices that are best for them. It's not to dictate or to try to redirect them to make choices that aren't actually the ones that they would make of their own accord. And that's the direction that we're unfortunately headed with all of these proposals.
Rachel Greszler is the research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements for the Heritage Foundation. You talk about the entitlements and the mindset of we are entitled to the services of all these different people in this social infrastructure plan that they're cooking up, and how bad it could wind up being for families when you realize that it's the government mandate. But there's also a cost as well, because eventually the dollar becomes so worthless you can't buy anything extra, and maybe that's the point, is that we're not supposed to want for anything extra and we should just take the government cheese.
Well, and this is a serious concern here, and some colleagues of mine at the Heritage Foundation had a paper out today. They work on the Index of Economic Freedom, and they're talking about inflation and just the threat because of the fiscal situation that the United States is in today and the amount of money that we are spending and have committed to spending compared to the amount of revenue that we're actually taking in. There is no end in sight to this. And if we were just basing our economic freedom rating on our finances alone, we would be in the economically repressed category.
Oh, my gosh.
This is one of the biggest threats that America faces today, is just this lack of any responsibility, any commitment to actually living within our means. Everybody expects American families to sit down at the kitchen table and do their budgeting and be responsible. And yet we have politicians in Washington who for years have been irresponsible and now are looking towards pathways of massively increasing the amount of debt and deficits. And this is just bankrupting our children.
What is, and on an existential level, when you see the protests in Cuba and then the president has to make it like it's class warfare in a communist country that's been communist since 1959, I don't know how he's making that leap. Maybe he just believes the media will report it as that and say, well, it's class struggle, the poor versus the wealthy. And on the day the January 6th Commission begins its hearings, a protester in Hong Kong may get life in prison for merely speaking out against the government. How is it we're starting to look at Cuba and communist China like these are the models we want to be more like, while they're having riots in the streets to try to be more like they think we are?
Yeah, and this is a big shift that's come in recent years. I mean, we've always talked about the ills of communist Cuba and China, and now you see some support from groups like Black Lives Matter in some ways defending the communist regime down there. It's troubling. I have talked about this on, kind of a general scale. I have 6 young children who are 12 years old and younger, and just talking about what are the different systems here and what do they look like for people. And really, you're talking about, do you want to have your personal freedom? Do you want a government that defends those liberties, or do you want a government that just usurps power and wants to be in control? And yes, everybody might have more similar things, but you all have way less. Mm-hmm. And I think that concept needs to be made more clear throughout history. We need to look back at history and what does that actually look like when you get those communist regimes in place. And we have plenty of examples today to point to, and I hope that Americans are realizing that that's not the pathway that we want. That's not the future we want for our kids.
Well, we are at a point where I think there are a lot of people who have no use for the rights laid out in the Bill of Rights that the government's there to protect, and they would prefer a right to an apartment, a right to a job, a right to health care, and they have no interest. They're like, you know what, I don't like free speech anyway, so you can get rid of it, and I don't like the church, so you can get rid of that as well, and I don't own guns, and I think guns are scary, so get rid of that. I worry in a world where the wrong things are rights now, and we're wholly inadequately constituted to provide that.
Yeah, it's scary, and I think that we need to be looking at a unified country and all being in this together, and not kind of creating two different camps of the people who are entitled to certain things and the people who must provide those things for everybody else, because that's the reality of it. If somebody is entitled to an apartment and good health care or a fair wage, who on the other side is the one that is mandated, mm-hmm. that is forced to provide that? And it's easy to say that you might want to be the one person that is entitled to receive these things, but you want to be the person who is mandated to go out there and do that. And when you look at history, that's what's the case sometimes. It's forced labor, for not fair wages. And that's the end result. Mm-hmm. Yes, in the short term, it may look like, because of the strong economy we have and because of what the free market has produced in the United States, that you would be able to get all these things that you want simply by taxing the wealthy and these big corporations. But that's not the end game.
Let me ask you this last one for you, Rachel Greszler, Heritage Foundation. somewhere Karl Marx is sitting amongst the wafting scent of brimstone, I'm sure, saying, why didn't I think of social infrastructure? It would have been easier to sell. But even Karl Marx, long before there was a Frankfurt, never mind the Frankfurt School, Rome did the same thing. They're chasing votes. The politicians just make Pyrrhic promises, usually attached to some sort of, funding spree or tax cut that never materializes, just to get them through the next election. You mentioned the governors that are courageously, curtailing these extended unemployment benefits. I've watched many of these states become hotbeds of poverty riots, and where the activist left is out there trying to gin up the poor to say our governor has taken away our money and has left us hungry in an effort to win campaigns in either November of this year or November of next year. How do we pull out of that, dog chasing his tail electoral cycle of just say what I need to say to get to the election and then worry about whatever happens after that once I'm in office?
Yeah, and I think it is disheartening that we're seeing a lot of government policies now that are aimed at getting people hooked on government benefits. What can I provide that will make people reliant on the government and therefore will vote for me in the future? But we are seeing, some at the state and local level, some governors that are out there that are doing the right thing. And the way that you get people to realize that is just by enacting the policies and showing what happens as a result of it. When you have governors who are saying, hey, I want people to actually work. We want to be productive in this state. We don't want to be idle. We don't want our businesses to fail because there aren't enough people that are willing to work for them to stay in business. And you're going to see rising incomes there. Workers are going to have higher wages. People are going to pay less in taxes. They're going to have more freedom to spend on what they want. This is the same thing that we saw after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Not only did it cut taxes for the middle class and for, the majority of Americans, but you saw the lowest earners receive the highest increase in their incomes over those periods after those tax cuts. And that's because the businesses were able to thrive. They were able to give those workers higher compensation. Not only that, but they were able to give them things that the government is talking about mandating through programs like paid family leave and other benefits. But that came from the workers desiring them and kind of the market demand. And when it comes from the market demand, you don't have the unintended consequences that you do when these things are implemented by government mandate instead. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm hoping that we can get to that point where these courageous governors don't bear the political blowback from their in-state left, but we will keep watching it. I appreciate it, Rachel Greszler, on this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and of course heritage.org, the Daily Signal, the great newspaper that they put out as well. Thank you so much for what you do, and keep on keeping on. And one of these days we'll get it right, and we can go back to just complaining about the Redskins not having a football team or a nickname.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.